Thank you very much for joining us today for another series in the Colmet Academy. My name is Judy Litsky, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Colmet. Just want everyone to know that you're muted, and you'll be muted throughout the presentation. What we will do is ask that any questions you have throughout the presentation, please type them into the question bar there on the right-hand side of your screen. And then what we'll do is we'll address all those questions at the end of the webinar. And just to let you know as well, this webinar is being recorded, and after the presentation is over, it'll be posted to the Colmet YouTube channel where you can go back and reference that video with the recording and the PowerPoint, later in the future if you want to share the information with someone. Before we get on to today's presentation, I just wanted to let you know about the other webinars we have upcoming here. And as you'll see on the screen here, we've got about 5 more sessions, well, 4 after today. We've already completed 3, and our next sessions will be powder booth selection and considerations. Then we have air makeup and curing, air makeup overview, curing solutions. And then the last webinar that we currently have scheduled is the marketing, sales, and tools. So anyway, if you haven't received that, please send an email to marketing@colmetsb.com. And I will make sure that you get this so you can attend any other future webinars you like. And now I'll turn it over to today's presenter, Chris Schock.
Thank you, Judy. I am Chris Schock. I am a Regional Sales Manager at Colmet. I've been with Colmet going on now for about 9 years, and this is first time I've ever given this presentation, so hopefully it's going to be fun. And I also want to thank everybody for taking a break from Tiger King to watch this presentation instead. So with that, we'll get going over NFPA and OSHA. To kick things off, this is our facility over in Rockwall, Texas. Being with Colmet for about 9 years, this is the second facility I've actually been a part of. So it's been a lot of fun to see us grow and build on top of that. Colmet has 3 main business segments. Our core catalog equipment, which is what we'll use a lot of these examples today to discuss what NFPA and the OSHA guidelines look and why the reference our equipment. The next segment is engineered projects. Engineered projects are anything from working with like a tier 1 large government, highly customized project with conveyors, large chemical pretreatments, stuff like that. And then also our RP filtration products. If you guys have had a chance to actually be on any of our previous webinars, you would have seen one of our Colmet's very own Trey Peavy. Oddly enough, he makes talking about paint drying and filtration relatively interesting, and definitely entertaining. With all that being said, again, this is interpretation of NFPA and OSHA requirements. You can see the big disclaimer on the screen, and that is because I am not an expert. As far as what we're going to go through, we are really condensing about 100 some pages of code and legalese into really just a few minutes here of this presentation, really just to help give you guys some guidelines about what to know, what to look for, what questions to ask. At the end of the day, I'm also not an attorney. So when it comes down to selling some of these projects and working with customers, it's always best to seek guidance from that local authority having jurisdiction. So really what to know and how to kick things off is approved. What is approved? And that's really just acceptable by the authority having that jurisdiction. And really what it boils down to is that authority having jurisdiction, or the AHJ, is really just an organization, an office, an individual responsible for enforcing those requirements. One thing that's unique about OSHA is self-funded. So OSHA is working essentially on commission. They're going out there trying to create revenue for themselves. So they are driving factors into providing the right equipment and the guidelines. So here's obviously a picture of what nobody wants to happen, and really why NFPA and OSHA exist. On the left, you'll clearly see what we call at the factory a thermal incident. Obviously, that's a pretty technical way of saying that's a horrendous fire. We make equipment that protects people from themselves. And whether you're calling in as a manufacturer, a distributor, or even an end user today, it's good to know these guidelines for your own process. So not only can you provide the right solution, but you can also increase safety and production and really just overall company protection. So with that being said, we talked about condensing 100-some pages. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to give you guys the boilerplates here. And you can see I've already gone through and highlighted some of the bullet points of really stuff to look at. So to kick things off and starting to talk about code is really understanding the construction and why a booth is made the way it is. So when we look at liquid and powder booth construction, NFPA calls out a gauge thickness or a steel thickness that is qualified by 18 gauge steel. If someone were to go to an insulated panel, you could actually get away with 2 20 gauge panels insulated with a styrofoam or some other type of rock wool. 18 gauge steel does not carry a 1 hour fire rating, but it is just called out for this thickness. That's a common misconception a lot of people ask about. When you look at powder booth construction, exclusively used for powder, there are other materials that are acceptable. Some people might see poly booths, or they're seeing a lot of new developments with 3D printing, and there's new materials that are coming up and being improved. And at the end of the day, if you see that bottom note there, listed spray booth assemblies that are constructed with other materials shall be permitted. There's just new technology, and it just means that it is open to interpretation. And as new technologies come out, the NFPA and OSHA codes will certainly take a look at those. And now that you guys understand really what a booth is made out of, it's a smooth surface. It prevents any kind of buildup. It's got a certain gauge thickness. It's really about the location and where you can put this thing. So separation from other operations. Other operations would be defined as sanding, grinding, assembly. It could even be in the office area where there's desks and computers. With that, these booths should be separated by at least 3 feet away or by a partition wall, ceiling, or floor. Ideally, by code, that wall or partition is going to have a fire resistance rating of 1 hour. So if you have multiple spray booths, you can put them near each other. But when you do have those partitions, you've got to take a look at that. Now, going to the next bullet point there, a clear space of not less than 3 feet shall be kept around that booth of any combustible materials. Going back to that a couple slides ago with a thermal incident, if something like that were to happen, you certainly don't want racks of paint, of rags, other components out there that would fuel that fire. So that's why they call for that spacing around that booth. Now, I know there's probably a lot of questions coming up by talking about spacing a booth 3 feet off a wall, 3 feet away from a ceiling, because we all know if you're in the field and trying to provide a solution, shop space is always a premium, and that floor space is always hard to get more of. So people always want to put these against that wall. Now, you can put these booths and this equipment up against the interior or exterior wall, assuming that wall does have that 1 hour fire rating, and mainly that spray booth can be maintained and cleaned and serviced. So again, depending on that local authority, if for whatever reason they don't want you to put that up against the wall, they could essentially deny that claim. But you can show them this code and say, hey, I can clearly get to my filters, I can get to my fan and motor. I shouldn't have any service issues. So hopefully that'll help save some shop space. Spray areas and booth egress. Now, this is always a tough one. Not less than 2 means of egress exceeding 25 feet. So if you actually are able to look at that picture on the right, you can see a plan view of a large truck booth. Now, this is a side downdraft. And with that, you can see the plenums are about 25 feet long, and between plenums, there's a break for an egress door. Product doors also offer egress, and this is sort of a tough one. We don't expect people to call us and say, hey, I need a 100-foot booth, and I'm going to calculate 6, 7 egress doors. This is something Coleman does every day, and we understand of how this goes together. On the flip side of it, when you're offering a solution in the field, depending on the type of draft, if you were to go to a cross draft, it's much easier to set doors in a cross draft cabin than it is a side down draft because you're not breaking plenums up and adding more fans. So this is just something to consider when you are recommending airflow and designing a booth. More spray areas. So this is a big one, especially in Texas. There's a lot of big projects, oil and gas projects. A lot of people don't want to buy that 100-foot booth. So you get a lot of people who just want to buy a spray plenum, a filter bank. If you're actually going out to a facility and looking at this, if somebody is going to do a spray area correctly, that area, which is the building and facility itself, needs to be constructed of non-combustible materials. The interior surfaces still need to be smooth, similar to a spray booth, preventing pockets from buildup. And now these partition walls need to actually have a 2-hour fire rating compared to a 1-hour fire rating if a booth was going to be up against that. So if somebody really wants to do a spray area, they're really making life difficult for themselves because they have more hoops to jump through. Now let's look at this 6.5.1. You have a 20-foot horizontal span and a 10-foot vertical span. And if you look over to the right, that's a good little cartoon of what a spray area looks like. You've got a 10-foot dome diameter in the middle of that spray area. So now you need a 20-foot radius off of that. So really what you've done for a 10-foot part, you've created a 50-foot wide spray area. So with that, you need to have explosion-proof lights. You need all your application equipment needs to be intrinsically safe. If you've got a guy that's got like a work light or a job radio, all those things are going to add up, and it creates a much more added cost versus just getting the booth to begin with. Here's a good example of what a spray room done right looks like. The top left picture, you can actually see exterior plenums that are mounted to the side of that building. Those fan and motors are actually located in that stack and outside, away from that hazardous environment. When you look at that lower center picture, you can see that those plenums are actually flush with that wall. The lights, some lights are in the ceiling and some lights are right above those filter banks. One of the things that we talk about interpretation, and I'll probably use that word probably 20 more times by the end of this presentation, is that spray area. What identifies a spray area? Is it the top of the filter bank? Is it the top of the part? Is it how long the hose can reach? So these are all things that local authority is ultimately going to have to give you the thumbs up or thumbs down on. And looking at those lights, I think we provide some explosion-proof lights, and they're several $1,000s each. So again, if somebody wants to just try to save some money by plenums, there's always a good application for some things, but sometimes they're just creating more cost than what it's worth. So now that you guys see a little bit about a spray area, take a look at this picture. So as you start to look at it, that plenum back there has about 2 filters tall. So it's really about 4 feet tall. You've got a fan and motor just a couple feet away. So any violations? Is that fan installed properly? Is it intrinsically safe? What about that lighting hanging down? That looks like a Harbor Freight compressor. I don't think anything from Harbor Freight is intrinsically safe, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've looked at that catalog. Look at the exterior walls. Is it a 2-hour fire rating? Is it nice and smooth? What else is kind of standing out? Think about the windows. All these things really add up, and doing something the right way is clearly what we want to be able to do and provide to our customers. So here's another one. You look at this large item here. What really jumps out? You know, you can say, hey, the lights actually look like they're 10 feet above, but that's okay. But then you look over to the picture on the right, you've got a 20-ton crane. Now, if that crane is in that spray hazardous area, that is a really expensive, intrinsically safe motor. So even if the fire marshal or the local authority having jurisdiction is okay with that, there's still no egress, because it's hard to tell from the picture, but that's about a 65-foot long piece. So being able to get out, have mechanical ventilation, there's a lot to it that a lot of people just don't look at. So exhaust. So exhaust, ductwork, and runs can really make or break a project. With that being said, we're going to spend a little bit more time in taking a look at how to route exhaust duct and what to look for when doing so. Exhaust duct needs to go outside of the building, period. It's really not even interpreted that much. We're going to talk about a few exceptions and what you have to do for that, but whenever you run it, it's got to go outside. The discharge needs to be directed away from any air intakes. What this means is if you go up through the roof, if you have an air conditioner up there, if you have some type of an air makeup unit, you got to be able to see what else is up there. You don't just want to get the roof height and say, cool, straight up, it's gone through, I'm good to go, because there could be a lot of hazardous things up there. A rule of thumb is discharging and terminating that stack 6 feet away from any exterior wall or roof. What that also translates to is you can't necessarily tuck this in a valley of a pitched roof, hoping that nobody's going to see this from the road. With that, if it's lower than the tallest point of that building, you could create additional buildup. It's unsightly, not to mention it could also create a fire hazard when some of that dry paint builds up. A big argument is everyone's, well, I'm spraying waterborne. Okay, that's fine, but waterborne in the dried state is still flammable. When you talk about 10 feet from openings into the building, you can't discharge this also if there's a window or a door due to air drafts and sort of wind speeds. This could carry all those VOCs and harmful contaminants back into the building or into somebody's office if it's not done correctly. Item number 6, this is actually a big one. So, shall not discharge in the direction of any combustible construction within 25 feet. So if people are doing projects in a refinery, you have to understand if this really could just, again, fuel a fire or affect another process nearby. This last one, number 8, discharged by a public way that is within 25 feet. So this is kind of a little odd way to say this, but what that translates to is sidewalks, parking lots. A big request we get is for people asking for a gravity louver so they can actually just go at a sidewall and terminate the duct there and not need any vertical rise. With that, if you're within 25 feet of those parking lots, sidewalks, that is not acceptable. And that's why we were seeing an increase in that louver not being approved by local jurisdictions for this code reason right here. So again, these are all things to look at, and nobody wants to go back after the project, make a second trip back to add another 30 feet of ductwork. And then at that point, you've got to consider fan, static pressure. So it's these little things knowing up front can help identify that and offer a better solution later. So I said ductwork has to go outside, period, except there are opportunities for recirculation and spray mode. So with that, you've got a pretty strict criteria that you have to meet, and these are just 5 bullets of what you got to target. The first one is you have to have particulate filters that will actually capture that. Ideally, this would probably be a carbon type filter that is going to capture some of the, hopefully all the VOCs, but most of the VOCs. With that, you can't have your vapors exceed 25% of that flammable limit. Now, to do that, you have to have a monitor. So you have to have a lifted equipment used to monitor those concentration of vapors in those exhaust streams. And if you actually look at that little picture on the right, that is an LEL, lower explosion limit sensor. If you're in Texas, it's called a sniffer. Either way, wherever you are, it's about $12,000 to $15,000. And this needs to be provided in each piece of duct. So going back to that 100-foot truck booth, we had 6 stacks. So now you've got to buy 6 of these. So that really adds up to the cost when people think they're just going to save on recirculating that duct. Now, those alarms are expensive, but they're really calibrated to a pretty fine point. And what they'll also do is they'll automatically shut down that spray operation. The last thing that needs to be addressed is toxicity for the worker. What that means is a full Tyvek suit, fresh air breathing supply, all these things need to be considered. There are manufacturers out there that are marketing these recirc and spray booths, but they're leaving it up to the end user to really fulfill all these requirements. And time again, people try to do it and it gets stopped mid-project because they can't get approved by their local jurisdiction. Here's just a good example of what a recirc would look like in a booth. You have fresh air ideally would go through an air makeup unit, through the working envelope of the booth, and then 100% exhaust outside. Now, the picture on the right shows the same downdraft booth, just configured where the air makeup unit would actually be ducted to that exhaust stream and actually pulls it out. So what's important about this picture is it still shows the 20% exhaust. This is for a cure process, but whether it's a cure or spray recirculation mode, it still needs to exhaust some outside. Now, I don't want to completely say that no one ever wants to recirc and spray mode, because there are good applications. And a good application would be a humidity controlled booth, temperature controlled, where it's very difficult and very costly to hold a certain dew point and a certain temperature point, say in Arizona. So those kind of things, it certainly makes sense to do. Manifolding, exhaust, ductwork. So this is another big one. A lot of people want to get 3 booths. They want to just put one hole in the roof because they're worried about leaks. I get it, but at the same time, it just doesn't work. So to do it, you have to have a certain type of dampener or valve in the manifold itself to prevent the fans from fighting each other, overcoming each other. And per code, it says an area square footage of booth opening does not exceed 18 feet squared. So if you have multiple booths you want to duct together, you know, I'm not a math major here, but you might be able to paint a couple model trains. There's just not much to it. With that being said, Coleman's stance on manifold and exhaust work is no, we're just not going to do it. The best rule of thumb is just keep it simple. It's for the best performance of the booth, the best safety, and the best process. That's pretty much our stance. And you can see here on the right, here are some good pictures of just doing that, of running individual ductworks. The exhaust fans and drives. So what's interesting about a spray booth is you have a hazardous environment, and then you need to have mechanical ventilation. So to do that, you've got to have a motor and a fan. With that, the impeller or shaft has to be made of certain components so it doesn't create a spark if there ever is an impact or if there is a buildup on the fan that doesn't get serviced. So this is a critical component of that booth that needs to make sure it qualifies for code. The motors themselves shall not be placed inside any spray areas or a hazardous area, which, going back to a few slides prior, you saw someone's idea of making a spray room, and that motor was within about 3 feet of where they were spraying. NFPA 7.12, the drying areas. This is a good one because what it talks about is somebody who's spraying something takes it out of the booth and lets it sit there. Per code, freshly sprayed workpieces need to be in an area that are power ventilated. So think about an automotive shop who's driven by a high production. They want to spray a vehicle, roll it off, and let it just cure somewhere in that shop. That vehicle is still continuing to off-gas and give off harmful VOCs. By code, they have to have a manual ventilation. So it's not that you're trying to upsell or get more equipment out of somebody, it's that you're trying to protect the workers and give them a better way to finish. So what we've covered is a lot of NFPA. Now here's a couple snippets from OSHA. OSHA 1910 talks about the construction of a spray booth shall be substantially constructed of steel, securely and rigidly mounted. With that's what I'm going to lead into here is some alternates. And what you guys might have seen is in our core catalog book, we have a limited finishing prep station that uses a curtain. Those curtains do have a fire rating, and what's unique about it is those curtains per square foot compared to 18 gauge galvanized are actually more expensive. People see those and they like the idea of having the curtain flexibility for shop space. But that last line in that 1910 there says non-combustible material may be used for intermittent or low volume spraying. That's why we put a limited finishing prep station, because it's only limited finishing which is defined by another code of 1 gallon of material sprayed in 8 hours. And clearly, spray booths are designed to sweep air currents toward the exhaust outlet. You don't want to open a door right next to exhaust and say, hey, I've got air movement. It needs to actually create a face velocity through that working cabin. So OSHA and NFPA, a little side-by-side for airflow requirements. OSHA actually calls out shall not be less than 100 linear feet per minute of velocity of airflow. 100 linear feet per minute translates to 1.1 mile an hour. Electrostatic spraying, such as like a powder booth or something like that, not less than 60 linear feet per minute. Now, if you go down to NFPA, NFPA calls out mechanical ventilation, but really what NFPA is concerned about is that lower flammable limit cannot exceed 25%. So interpretation of NFPA and OSHA requirements, we're going to talk about filters for a sec. Over on the right is a manometer, and you can see that little red arrow just went up to that green point. All booths need to be shipped with a manometer per code, and manometers need to be set up and functional. A majority of them never get put on, they dry out, people just don't service them. When that booth is operating at a higher capacity and the filters pack out, you'll actually see that red travels up to that red mark. Now, these manometers actually do come with those arrows to set, and it really makes it sort of a foolproof design of when you need to change filters. When it gets to that red point, that doesn't mean remove a couple filters so air can flow more freely. It just means you got to change your filters. So here's a shout out to all my filter salesmen there. OSHA 1910 talks about residue disposal. Residue scrapings need to be immediately removed from the premises and disposed of properly. Approved metal waste cans for rags that were impregnated with finishing materials such as rags, waste, deposited filters. All that needs to essentially, let me make sure I get this right because Trey's going to be mad if I don't. The contents of waste cans in these filters need to be disposed of at least once daily or at the end of each shift. Our filters have a great capacity load, but per code in OSHA, it says every day those things should be changed out, if not every shift. So when people ask, how often should I do it? There we go. So here's kind of a fun one. You guys will see these on the internet. We do not compete against these things because, again, these are not real spray booths. The material in there, there's no lighting, airflow, the ventilation, these are all a bit of a disaster. And in fact, if you look at that one in the upper right-hand corner, that looks like a child's tent. I'm not sure how you can actually sell it as a spray booth, but I guess if you put it on the internet, someone's going to buy something. So you guys will probably see some of these in the field. But that was pretty much the NFPA and OSHA wrapped up in just a few minutes. And now it's a portion where if you guys have any questions, feel free to type some out. And Judy will hopefully help get this facilitated.
All right, thank you. As Chris had mentioned, everybody, please, if you have any questions, type them into your question bar there on the side. However, before we get into the questions, actually, I wanted to mention one more thing. You will notice that on your toolbar under the handout section, there is a handout which is a PDF of today's presentation. Please, before you log out, please download that handout so you have a copy of this presentation if you would like to share it with someone or review it at a later time. So please make sure you download that handout. And Chris, it looks like we do have a few questions coming in. The first one says, is it an individual or just the company that's responsible for enforcing codes and regulations?
Responsible for enforcing. So the local authority is going to be the one that is going to be the enforcing factor. But with the company being the end user, it is always the ownership and responsibility of that end user to take ownership of that process and their responsibility. And as far as doing that, it's very difficult for a manufacturer to a distributor to really understand what that local county is going to require. So it really just takes part of understanding everybody's scope of effort on that. That would be my quick answer.
Okay. One more here. If there's any conflicting information or if you feel that you're getting information that's different from one agency to the other, is there ever an incident where one, such as OSHA, has precedence over NFPA or NFPA over OSHA?
That's a really good question. With that, and yes, there are going to be conflicting questions. And even if you really do read through NFPA and OSHA thoroughly, they will contradict each other. So it really depends on, again, that local authority is going to be able to supersede everybody. So whether you're an end user, again, distributor or manufacturer, it's part of our responsibility not just to provide this, but also educate these people on this process and what this equipment can do and what's needed. And again, that's why we're putting up these NFPA and OSHA presentations for you guys to reference, just as a quick guide to say, hey, per this design, this is what this calls for. And unless they really have a personal issue or something with that customer, that's where that would potentially get overridden.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more here. When it comes to permitting to install a spray booth, one, do I need a permit? And if I do, whose responsibility is it to get that permit?
Good question. Yes, these do need to be permitted. I have unfortunately seen people who get them, put them in, and hopefully to fly under the radar. It usually makes matters a lot worse. Typically, if you're willing to work with your local authority, your local county, they are happy to help. There are certain people that do offer services to do this. But then again, if you are an end user looking to have somebody get your permits, you are essentially going to be hiring somebody to stand in line. As a manufacturer of Colmet, one of our policies is we will give you any information that you request that will help facilitate that process. So our terms and exclusions say all that's not essentially would not be the responsibility of Colmet, but there are, again, certain people that will do that work for you.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Right now, it seems like that's all the questions, but if you think of another question, you still have time to type it in if you like. If you think of a question after the webinar is over, please don't hesitate to email that to us and we'll try and get that answer for you. But also just wanted to remind everyone about the handout. Don't forget to download your handout of the presentation. Also, too, is that there will be a short survey you'll receive about an hour after this webinar just to kind of tell us how we did. So if you wouldn't take a minute, just take a minute and go ahead and answer the simple 2 or 3 questions that you can answer to tell us how we did. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this presentation will be on the Colmet YouTube channel. We'll post that tomorrow, so you can always go there tomorrow to the YouTube channel, check it out. If you can't find it, search for the title of it and you'll see the presentation come up, or just go direct to the Colmet YouTube channel. Chris, if you wouldn't mind just scrolling to the next slide there for me, since we don't have any other questions.
Sure. So with this, here's also,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Judy.
Chris. Yeah, this is just a who to call list. Chris presented today, but I just wanted to let you know that here is a map identifying your regional sales managers. And, if you need to contact anyone there, their contact information is there as well. Again, that's in the handout. And then the next slide, I think that is just a recap of our upcoming Oh, no, I'm sorry. One more slide here. This is just showing the Colmet YouTube channel. So as I mentioned, all the videos and our presentations will be there. So you can just click and go right to the Colmet YouTube channel and download those. And then on the left there, in some previous sessions, people have asked about how to request a quote. So I just wanted to mention it. On the left picture there shows the Colmet website, and all you have to do is click on that quote request button, and you can enter all the information about your quote. And then the next slide here is just a recap of the upcoming webinars. Again, a few people during the presentation have asked for the email. It's marketing@colmetsb.com. I'll be more than happy to send you a little flyer that gives you these the dates and the times for the presentation. You simply click on the time, and then that'll register you for the event. So thank you very much for your time today. And Chris, thank you for the presentation, and thank you for your attendance, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
The webinar
will
now be ended. Thanks, Chris.